the newsagents.
Mr. Speaker, the alleged comments were wrong, they were racist, and he has now, as I said, the comments were wrong, they were racist. He has rightly apologised for them, and that remorse should be accepted, Mr. Speaker. As I said, the gentleman apologised genuinely for his comments, and that remorse should be accepted. As I said, the comments were wrong. The gentleman in question has apologised for them, and that remorse should be accepted.
That remorse should be accepted over and over again. He's apologised, he's shown contrition, he wants to move on, it's time we all moved on. Let's forget about it, and let's just keep that 10 million quid in the bank.
That was Rishi Sunak, of course, talking about Frank Hester, who has now apologised for the comments he made by saying they were rude, not racist, not sexist, not threatening or dangerous, but rude. Is that going to be enough to help Rishi Sunak move on from yet another race row and another row that asks big questions of his own leadership and his relationship to his own colleagues? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And I think we need to do this in two parts, which is the row over Frank Hester's comments, the way the government has behaved, the slowness, the tardiness to accept that it was racism, the ministers who were made to look absolute fools yesterday when they came out and denied it all, only for Downing Street to kind of go, oh, yeah, okay, it was racist in the evening. And then there are the wider questions this leaves about Rishi Sunak's leadership, whether he will lead the Tory party into the next election, and the threats that are now around him because of the seeming inability to manage anything right now in terms of delivery in government.
Yeah, and I think this is, as Emily was alluding to, this has become bigger now than just the arguments about race, which are substantial, and as we were saying yesterday, it highlights the complicated, increasingly complicated relationship the Conservative Party has had with more and more normalised extreme views. It is also in the manner in which Sunak has handled this and continues to mishandle it, as you say, John, sending ministers out hour after hour to defend a line which is clearly untenable, which is clearly indefensible, which happened all day yesterday. And if we think about the timeline yesterday, initially it was, well, don't really want to comment about it. Then it was, it's not racist. Then Kemi Badenoch comes out at 4:00 and says it is racist. And by 6:00, number 10 Downing Street is accepting that it's racist. That happens yesterday. And the whole sorry pattern is starting all over again today, with ministers being sent out, in the case of Kevin Hollinrake, the Post Office Minister, being sent out to say that, OK, maybe it was racist, but by the way, we would actually take the same amount of money from the same guy all over again.
If Mr Hester today said, right, I'd like to give you another £10 million, would you take it?
Well, on the basis that we don't believe Ms Hester's a racist, yes. But I've got to say, all those people I spoke to yesterday, I spoke to members of the public and postmasters and...
Jesus.
Look, nobody wants to be the person, either yesterday or today, that is sent out to try and get the line right, surely before Rishi Sunak changes his mind. Because yesterday, just to remind you, pretty senior, pretty seasoned cabinet ministers like Mel Stride were using language like, oh, it was intemperate or it was inappropriate. Weirdly, it reminded me of interviewing Prince Andrew when he talked about, you know, Epstein's behaviour being unbecoming. And I just went, he was a sex offender. Yeah. You sort of can't help yourself. And sure enough, a day later, they're saying, well, yes, we're allowed to say racist now. Tick. So they're going out saying it was racist, absolutely categorically racist. The next question, of course, is, well, surely you don't want to accept money. You don't want to be bankrolled by a racist, do you? And the answer to that still today, as you've heard, is,
maybe.
It's all right.
Yeah,
why not? It's another, you know, so they're stuck in this place where they're only going with the latest line that Rishi Sunak has allowed them, because they can't sort of drop him in any place he's not. I mean, don't forget, it was Kwasi Kwarteng, actually, who came out yesterday lunchtime, first of all, and said it was racist. Kemi Badenoch came out and said very categorically it was racist, and then Rishi Sunak followed his party rather than led his party. And I think increasingly that's a very, very uncomfortable position for the Prime Minister to be.
It's a very destabilising one.
Of course it is. And you just look at this last 24 hours, but you can widen it out beyond the 24-hour timescale and look at the way the Lee Anderson thing was handled. You go back to what Rishi Sunak said when he came into Downing Street, that he promised that there would be integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level. There has not been integrity over this. Professionalism has been woefully lacking in government handling, in just the sort of basic political skills of communication and working out what the trajectory of a story would be, and knowing that you're going to be forced into a climb down if you're going to try to deny that what Hester said was racist, given he talks specifically about Diane Abbott being black and it makes him want to hate all black women and she should be shot. And then you get the question of accountability. And there is no accountability over this 10 million quid that the Tories party has now trousered. And yeah, political parties can't run on fumes. They need money. But you need to be able to check where the money is coming from and that the people are of decent character. Because this is now a millstone round the Conservative Party neck, because they're never going to give that money back.
But this is what is also so rotten about this whole story. One of the many things that's rotten about it, and the whole party funding system, right? We would not be having this conversation, let's be honest, if Hester had donated, say, £100,000 or £50,000 or £1,000. If this was
he hadn't made £135 million from NHS contracts.
Well, and if he had just been some, local party member somewhere, the Conservative Party would have dropped him like a stone. The reason they haven't dropped him like a stone, and the reason why, if you're just trying to get inside the heads of why they've adopted these sort of Houdini-esque contortions of sort of political kind of communications over the last 24 hours, is not just because they're kind of quite useless at politics and comms, which they are, but it's also because they're so concerned. They knew that the moment that they accepted that he had said something racist, the next question is, well, are you going to give the money back? Now, I think actually there's a perfectly nimble way around that is reasonable, as we were saying yesterday, which is, look, we've spent the money now, but would we accept money from him in the future? No, we wouldn't. They are probably also afraid, by the way, that he basically does an Aaron Banks, and this basically happened, a similar thing happened with Aaron Banks, big sort of Brexit backer, back in the 2010s, where Cameron made it clear he wasn't going to accept any more money from him, and he just went and gave a load of money to UKIP. So I suspect that part exactly. So I suspect part of their calculation is fear that out of spite and pique, Hester then goes and gives a load of money to reform off the back of all this.
I think there's another mechanical reason in this, which is that when Boris Johnson sent people out to sort of repeat his lies, whether it was about Chris Pincher, whether it was about Partygate, whatever it was, they felt they owed it to him because he was a great campaigner and he had essentially won them their seats. He had given them this 80-seat majority. I don't think they have that with Rishi Sunak. And I don't think Rishi Sunak has that many foot soldiers. I don't think that they have a lot of people who are going to do the leafleting, do the knocking on doors, become the ground army for Rishi Sunak in election. So the money is even more important because actually it has to go into digital advertising, billboards, the stuff that they haven't got kind of actual people, actual warm bodies to do for him.
I think the other comparison to make in this is interesting about the Boris Johnson years compared to Sunak is that when ministers were told to go out and lie on Boris Johnson's behalf, they probably didn't know it was a lie. They had been given in good faith what they thought was a solid rebuttal.
They didn't ask.
Or they didn't
ask.
Don't tell me too much, and I'll go out and do that line. What Rishi Sunak asked ministers to do was to go out and dissemble yesterday with a line that was just implausible and that anyone could see was indefensible. And they were made to look buffoons. I mean, I just, Mel Stride, the other ministers who went out, I just must feel like they're idiots.
I think of Mel Stride as having a lot of credibility. Actually, he's pretty straight talking. He's very easy
Graham
to
Stewart's
have
the same. These are all perfectly decent people.
Right. And yet you're just thinking, please don't call me. Don't send me out. Don't make me do the radio. Don't make me do the
And that's
TV.
one of the reasons it's destabilising, right? Because once you commit enough of those mistakes and you are the minister of the moment or the MP of the moment, discipline just starts to break down. I mean, the fact that, Badenoch, we should talk about Badenoch, right? Because the fact that Badenoch comes out at Hartford. She's not only the business secretary, she's also the Women and Equalities Minister. And she comes out with these series of tweets, which actually, funnily enough, in their own way, were also a little bit mealy-mouthed and also a bit qualified and also spread...
But they were cleverer.
Exactly. They spread the lie about as well, which has continued today, which we should also talk about, which is the idea that he's shown contrition.
And remorse.
And remorse. But he hasn't. He's not really. He's just...
you can be remorseful.
Yeah, I'm
that
sure
you
he's
were
sorry
found
this has
out.
happened.
Exactly.
Yes, I'm sure he's very remorseful that it's happened. But the point is that they were far more dexterous and agile. And actually, if the tweets that she had put out had basically been the number 10 line first thing in the morning, I don't think we'd be talking about this now. And I don't think it would have dominated the news cycle for the last 36 hours. And that is destabilising in another sense, which is that, Conservative MPs are sat there looking at this potential rival to the Prime Minister going, God, she's better at this than he is, isn't she?
I do think we should point out that the Tory tactic on this to try and get back to Labour has been threefold. One, look at us, we're a much more racially diverse party. We've got a much more racially mixed cabinet than Labour has ever had. Second, Labour's used words like lynching, Angela Rayner's used words like scum. Why don't you look to your own language? And third, actually, what are you doing about Diane Abbott, right? Diane Abbott has been suspended from the Labour Party, lost the Labour whip for coming up to a year now. And I think what's interesting is that in normal times, all those arguments would have far greater traction. I think you would see a sort of moment of reflection from Labour MPs on the panels or from, a Labour leader of the opposition who had to counter those. This time, because Rishi, I think, is sort of losing his own people, none of those are sticking quite as solidly as they should do, to be frank. I mean, I think there are questions now for Starmer, and we saw Diane Abbott in the Commons, in the chamber today, without the whip, clearly trying to embody the person who's saying, hello, am I still a Labour MP for you?
I totally understand the Tory tactics of trying to say, look at you, before you start throwing mud at us, have a look at yourself in the mirror.
Yeah.
I just don't buy it that there is an equality of guilt on this at the moment. I mean, if you were to attack the Labour Party when Corbyn was leader and say, look at the problem you've got with anti-Semitism in your party, you couldn't throw the same thing at the Conservative Party at that particular time. At the moment, you would have to say there is a problem of racism in the Conservative Party, and that actually Keir Starmer has dealt with a lot of the problems that are being thrown at him now. And I just think this is, at the moment, a peculiar Conservative problem where they fear that the right is kind of making strides without them, and that therefore they need to move towards the mild racism of their supporters.
I agree, but I think Johnson would have blustered his way through that and made it a Starmer problem. Rishi doesn't have that political capital within his own party to do that as well. Right.
That is true. Although I think also part of this story is that there's just been so much water passed under the bridge. I mean, John, to develop your point, I think you can say absolutely that both the Labour Party and Conservative parties have had problems with racism in their ranks and up to the very top of the parties in recent years. The difference is that Labour Party has accepted it and is willing to be judged about it. The Conservative Party right now isn't really often willing to even accept that there is a problem. So how can you possibly address it if you don't accept that there's a problem? And that goes up to and including the micro level of this story, right? Because the current Sunak line, again, to talk about indefensible lines or lies, is that Sunak, and he said it in the Commons today as well, he continued this point to say that Hester has said that he's sorry and we should accept his contrition. Now, again, to go back to that point, if he had accepted he was sorry, he accepted that the comments were racist, that would be legitimate. But he hasn't done so. And that's something that Stephen Flynn, the SNP leader in the Commons, picked up on in PMQs.
Why is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom putting money before morals?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as I said, the comments were wrong. The gentleman in question has apologised for them, and that remorse should be accepted.
Stephen Flynn! This is complete rubbish. The gentleman in question apologised for being rude. He wasn't rude, he was racist, he was odious, and he was downright bloody dangerous.
So yes, I think if the Conservative Party line right now was to say that we think that he should accept that the comments were racist, and indeed, you know what, Sunak, and again, we talk about being the frog in the boiling water. Like Sunak could have apologised to Diane Abbott in the Commons today. He could have said, on behalf of the Conservative Party, you're in the chamber right now. I'm sorry on behalf of the Conservative Party for what's happened. It must have been a very difficult 24 hours to you. And again, if we had known what we know now, we wouldn't have accepted this donation, and we won't be accepting anything from him in future. If you say that, very difficult to know what the rejoinder is to that. Yeah, again, you can press the idea, well, you should give it back. But that would have been powerful. Instead, as so often with Sunak, he sounded irritated, he sounded tetchy, and he just allowed this story to build yet further.
Or he's a man worried that he's got more Tory donors that might be outed as saying terrible things, and he doesn't want to start something he can't stop.
Well,
on that
maybe.
line of sort of respectful comments, I thought it was very noticeable that it was Keir Starmer today that stood up to pay tribute to Theresa May, who's just announced that she's retiring. She'll be resigning at the next election, and he commended her work on modern slavery. And I thought, isn't that interesting that we've got to a point where Rishi Sunak is starting to sound like the tetchy, sort of scrappy, sort of leader of the opposition almost, and Keir Starmer is the one who is sounding much more benevolent, to be able to offer this sort of, across the aisles admiration for a former Prime Minister. We've kind of changed things over.
Totally. Just 2 footnotes to add to Prime Minister's questions, because it was such a fascinating session. One, I thought it was terrible that the Speaker did not call Diane Abbott to ask a question, because she was jumping up and down, wanting to catch the Speaker's eye, and she conspicuously failed to do that. And I thought that was a bad miss by Lindsay Hoyle. The other thing that was just a little vignette to see sitting together on the benches, George Galloway and Lee Anderson sitting side by side.
The brothers grin.
Two cheeks, as he might have said, of the same backside.
We'll be back in a moment. And the other thing, kind of perusing the TV channels last night as I was, to see on Sky Sam Coates, the sort of deputy political editor, talking about how the chairman of the 1922 committee, Graham Brady, who is the sort of grim reaper of Conservative backbenchers, he's the one who goes in and says, sorry, your time's up. Had an unscheduled meeting apparently with Rishi Sunak the night before. And you kind of think, what's all that about?
Wearing his grey suit.
The man in a grey suit with the glass of whiskey and the pearl-handled revolver that you administer to a Prime Minister who you think it's time, dispatches himself. And you wonder what that meeting was all about and how significant it was. I mean, I just wonder whether there is a straw in the wind that actually not just Hester, a whole series of things are coming together to form a perfect storm against Rishi Sunak.
We are all primed. We are all on sort of election watch
Always.
or resignation watch or coup watch the whole time. And I took that Sam Coates, and I think, he wasn't the only one who was talking about a meeting. And I took that to a fairly senior Conservative this morning, and I said, what was all that about? And immediately I just got this sort of reply, protocol, all normal, nothing to see here, nothing to see here. And so I started to ask if, an election was in the offing, if they thought that was coming, or if a coup was in the offing. They said, no, there will be no May election. The only person who wants a May election is about 3 people, and they are, to quote this person, morons. The rest of us want to wait till December. And by that you understand that wait till December means have as long as we can in jobs we love before we lose them. There is kind of a complete open admission, I think, within the Tory ranks now that there isn't a hope in hell. And I said, but, you would say that, wouldn't you? Is there something going on? And I talked to one other person who said, there are the usual 12, you can put the names to it, the Danny Krugers, the Miriam Cates, the Suella Bravermans, who are basically always plotting and always trying to overthrow. Until it gets to 100, there is no problem. Because quite frankly, if Rishi thought that they were out to get him and remove him, he'd just pull the trigger. He'd call an election. And I guess that's the question. Can he always do that? Can he always resort to the calling of an election before he gets removed?
Well, I suppose there are 2 separate questions, aren't there? There is the question of whether there could be a May election, and that would be something obviously Sunak would choose to do. He's just going to roll the dice because he thinks his political situation is going to deteriorate further throughout the year. And there's the question about whether there is a coup, or rather than a coup, maybe hit the sort of 50 or so threshold of letters that you need to be sent to Graham Brady to get to the 1922 committee to trigger a contest. And I suppose the thing is, if there were a contest in motion, i.e. if Brady were to go to Sunak and say, I've the threshold has been breached, I've got to set in motion a leadership ballot. I think in that situation it would be pretty constitutionally dicey for Sunak to say, right, I'm going to go to the country, I'm going to go to the king. Put the king in a very difficult position in that situation, because you could argue that the Conservative Party internal process had to sort of work its way out, rather than Sunak using the prospect of an election to sort of get around that. But I think that the role as ever of Brady becomes really important, right? Because Brady often does tell the Prime Minister, it is said, if the threshold is looking dicey, i.e.
if you're
Prime
getting
Minister,
near,
we're only a couple away here, just to let you know. And I always check, and what he tends to do is go and phone around MPs before he goes to the PM and says the threshold of letters has been breached. He tends to go to them and say, are you absolutely sure that you want your letter to still be in? It's not just sort of sitting in my safe and you've forgotten about it, etc. So his role as ever, and he's done this, he did it with May, he's done it with Truss, he did it with Johnson. He's very, very practiced and seasoned at this now, sort of seeing off an undertaking.
The Tory party's undertaking.
Yeah,
but they weren't
Prime
in
Ministers.
positions to actually call an election. They wouldn't have done that. The difference is that Rishi can hold this sort of Damocles above his MP's head and say, if you don't follow me, this is what's going on. The trouble is, of course, once he's called the election, what happens if nobody wants to go out and fight for him? What happens if everyone, campaigns in their own border and nowhere else?
Just to go back to one of your questions, that it puts the king in an awkward position. I don't think it does, because I think to call an election in the fifth year of a parliament is perfectly normal.
But it would be very unusual, and in fact I can't think of a single occasion where this had happened, where...
What, to avoid a leadership contest?
Avoid a leadership contest, that's my point.
Well, that was what Johnson tried. Yeah, but it's also pretty unusual to try and change MPs,
PMs.
try and change PMs 3 times without an election.
I just think that the King's private secretary, particularly in his current condition, let's put it that way, might sort of express to Downing Street their displeasure at that, and that would be enough. And I think far more likely anyway in that situation, weirdly enough, is I think that just like happened to Thatcher and then to Major and then actually to Truss and to Johnson, actually there is a ballot. And he probably wins it, because there's still enough residual support on the Conservative backbenches for him, and fear of what could replace him, that there would be enough MPs who would be willing to back him. But then it just ends up in a situation you're just beleaguered. You just have to just limp on.
I mean,
and then just like Truss, just like May and Johnson, they're actually gone in quite short order anyway.
I mean, there is this wonderful parallel world where Rishi is waiting for us to win the Euros and win the Olympics and secure enough gold medals that everyone, suddenly decides he's a brilliant Prime Minister. I don't know how much thought there is behind that sporting success is going to get us to
Harold
a place.
Wilson, 1966, and the World Cup.
Okay.
England only wins under Labour governments.
Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, it hasn't happened since. Can I just point out that?
Yeah, that is true. We haven't had that many Labour governments since. Maybe that's it. But I think actually in a weird sort of way, I think the crucial question at the moment is actually, or crucial commodity, is just to what extent have most Conservative MPs just given up? And the answer, if the question is actually, or the answer to that is actually most of them, and bear in mind how many of them are stepping down anyway, I've already said they're going to step down, bear in mind how many more of them know they're going to step down, but it just hasn't been publicly revealed yet because Downing Street wants to stagger them so it doesn't look an absolute flood or an absolute rush of them. If that's the case, actually, you become less interested in kind of internal political leadership machinations. And it becomes as simple as this, and it's kind of a bit weird to say, but some MPs just want as many paychecks as possible until such time. And I'm not saying that in a derogatory way, by the way. I understand it in the sense that it's actually quite hard sometimes to get a job after you've been an MP, and you're just trying to push it as long as possible. And there's a big difference between 9 months of extra pay and becoming redundant in 6 weeks' time.
Look, a couple of days ago on the podcast, we talked about the fact that we'd all placed bets on when the election would be. The sweepstake. The 50 quid that we put each into the kitty. No, it's 50. Right. And I had said it would be a May election. I want to revise my bet.
No, William Hill.
Let me just give you the revision. The revision I want is that there will be a May election with Rishi Sunak leading the Conservative Party. And if it's not a May election, it will be later with someone else leading the Conservative Party.
You can't go into corals and just change your bets.
Well, no, I'm just saying that I think if it's a later election, there is a very high probability it won't be Rishi Sunak leading the Conservative Party into it. Go on, what do you think? Do you think he leads the Tory party into the next election?
I do, actually. Yeah. I think too many of them have given up, and I don't think that there is an obvious alternative. I mean, every week that goes by at the moment, or every day that goes by, he's making that bet harder to sustain. And there are certainly plenty of Conservative MPs at the moment who are looking at the last 24 hours, 48 hours and thinking, actually, is this guy and not just his guy, but his team, right? Are they actually capable of getting through an election campaign, right? Because there's this argument to say that once an election campaign begins, everyone becomes more disciplined and everyone gets on message. Actually, as we all know, election campaigns can be the most unpredictable and vociferous kind of few weeks that you get in politics.
Yeah, but
and
it
you
can
have
also
to be
cut a
even
Labour
more.
lead. I mean, that's the thing.
it could
What
do.
they're hoping for, what they're waiting for, is a big Labour mistake. I guess one of the questions I'd ask is whether anyone could win this for Rishi Sunak, apart from Rishi Sunak now. And the only person that is sort of spoken about in those hallowed terms is David Cameron, actually.
Do you mean win it for the Conservative Party?
Win it for the Conservative
Right.
Party. Now, would David Cameron ever take on that mantle? I
mean, there
can't
are some
see it.
weird whispers around.
Yeah,
about
but
that.
why would you, having won one election, right, then put yourself back in the position where you're almost certainly going to lose one?
Hard to do it from the Lords. I don't see how you can do it from the Lords. I
It
think it's
all
just
seems.
impossible.
But
You can be head
reali-
of the party from the Lords.
Yeah, but you can't be Prime Minister.
You
from the
can't.
Lords. And so how can you lead the party into an election? I just don't see how that works.
But that
Unless
these
he gives
theories
it up.
are even being discussed and being ventilated is a sign just of the weakness of Rishi Sunak's position that, Boris Johnson comes back, fights the by-election, leaves the Conservative Party. David Cameron renounces his peerage, stands for Parliament, and also...
Not gonna happen.
Because it's just not going to happen. It's not real world.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. If David Cameron had been leader of the Conservative Party, you can guarantee that the line over the last 48 hours would have
Yeah.
been a considerably superior one.
One
And,
thing-
particularly when you consider how much investment he put in the early 2010s and before that into resurrecting or revivifying the Conservative Party's reputation with ethnic minorities. And that's basically, there are lots of Tory MPs who now just think that's shot to bits.
One thing I think we should mention is if Rishi Sunak's legacy is summed up in one word, it's probably going to be Rwanda. And it's going to be a policy that he tried so hard to get through and failed to get through. And overnight, we've had news that not only have they essentially recognised that this may not work as the policy they first initiated or first dreamt of, but they're now talking about giving illegal immigrants money to go to Rwanda. Upwards of £3,000. Exactly, in other words, what Israel tried to do when it was told that it couldn't send people back to Rwanda because it was deemed an unsafe country. You are now talking about something that was meant to be the biggest deterrent. The biggest deterrent.
£3,000.
Yeah, is now £3,000. Would you like to come and spend a little bit of time here and then get paid to go to another country?
Because the threat of Rwanda was going to stop the small boats.
Because the threat was going to be the big deterrent that turned people away, and now we're talking about enticing them with thousands.
But because you're still coming, here's a cheque for £3,000.
Yeah, it's a very hard one for him to resell on the doorstep.
We'll be back in a moment. Just before we go, did I ever tell you I used to be in Washington?
No.
By the way,
Drink.
by the way, Mike,
In North America.
my daughter sent me a message saying I just loved it when they ripped the piss out of you over that.
Yeah, because
So
imagine how
thanks.
much they've heard it.
Exactly. But anyway, in the White House briefing room yesterday, it's not
Where John
often
lives.
It's not often that Britain events in the UK impinge upon the White House briefing room, but they did yesterday, and you will understand the context with this question.
Does the White House ever digitally alter photos of the president, vice president, first lady, or something like that before they release?
Digitally altered? Not that I know of. I would say no. Why would we digitally alter photos? Are you talking about? Are you comparing us to what's going on in the UK?
I'm doing due diligence to ensure that the leader of another country wouldn't alter photos.
Why does
of
the
themselves
monarch
before-
have to do anything with us? No, that is not something that we do here.
That was the spokeswoman Karine Jean-Pierre having to defend Joe Biden's photographs, which she said would not be tampered with. Very much in the tone of voice of somebody who says, "Well, we're a republic. We're not a monarchy. We're not bossed around by the royals."
Well, I mean, you've got to hand it to ministers here, and I think if we're going to go down the conspiracy theory route, we should discuss this. Maybe the ministers here, Sunak and whatever, they're just extremely patriotic, and they're just doing Kensington Palace press office, who, by the way, are having a better week with each day that goes by, a bit of a favour.
So it's all incredibly clever on Rishi Sunak's part. Why hadn't we seen that at the start of this podcast?
Just doing his king and
Thank
prince
you
a
for your
favour.
service.
Thank you for your service. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.